Mais um episódio de Isto Não É Assim Tão Simples arranca agora e hoje vamos falar sobre mobilidade social, ou seja, subir na vida e explicar por que razão não é assim tão simples. Vamos fazê-lo com um perito na matéria, um conceituado economista norte-americano, John Friedman, que é diretor do Departamento de Economia na Brown University, é também editor da American Economic Review e tem focado grande parte da sua carreira neste tema precisamente. John, it's fantastic to get an opportunity to speak with you on our foundation show. This is such a fascinating topic as well, as far as social mobility and the opportunities that we all have in our lives and in our lifetime. I think it'd be pretty fair to say that it'd be a good way to start to define exactly what it is, according to you, in social, cultural, and economic terms.
Thanks so much, Pedro. It's so great to be with you here today. I think of social mobility as really just the basic concept that everyone should have a shot. And whether it's by race or by family income or where you grow up, no one should have their life opportunities limited by the circumstances of their birth. And I think the unfortunate reality, though, is that in many countries across the world, too many children really have very limited opportunities just because of where they're born, not because of how smart they are or anything else like that. And I think trying to increase those opportunities, that's the heart of social mobility and economic opportunity.
Okay, so according to your experience, what are the key principles of promoting and protecting the principle of social mobility and making sure that it is as, I don't want to use the word fair, but it's as possible as can be?
So in our experience and what we see in the data, it's really all about childhood and young adulthood. And it's not so much about, creating jobs for people. It's about educating people so that they're going to be able to get those jobs. They're going to be able to contribute to society in whatever way is possible. And, just to give you a simple example, think about someone growing up to become an inventor. Even when you take kids who are absolutely the top scorers on, let's say, a math test in third grade, kids who come from rich families, kids who come from white families, boys are much more likely to grow up to become inventors than children from non-white families, children from poor families, or women. And that's a great example where it's not that these kids aren't smart. They're all phenomenally smart. It's just that society shapes expectations for these kids and limits opportunities in a way that really not only is bad for the kids, but it's really bad for society as well, right? Think of all those Einsteins that we've lost because they just weren't quite in the right social situation in order to grow up and be able to contribute in such a way.
We'll get stuck into the details of some of the thoughts you shared there and some of those differences between sex or education. But I did want to, in this part of the conversation, as we kind of prepare the landscape for the details, I did want to talk to you about the American dream because you're American. It's really a concept that has been promoted and well promoted throughout the decades as far as in the States, anything's possible. I studied there, I worked there, I felt that in the States a lot more than I felt it in other countries, the possibilities of going up in life, of having doors open for you if you work hard enough and if you are persistent enough, more than I would say Portugal, for example, where I still feel that there are a lot more limitations as far as class especially and education and family names, etc. But we'll also get into that. But as far as the States, is the American dream still alive?
What's fascinating is that this American dream, exactly as you say, it's something that everyone across the world believes in. You ask Americans about it, you ask Europeans about it, and they'll say, go to America, that's the land of opportunity. What's amazing is that when you look in the data, in fact, kids who grow up, for instance, in low-income families have a better shot at reaching the top of the income distribution in many countries in Europe or in Canada than they do in America.
Wow.
And so it's this really amazing contrast where, in many ways and for many people, to be clear, they have found ways to succeed in the US. And I also agree with you that I think, class in very different in concept and in the U.S. But it's amazing how the mythology, I think, kind of outruns the reality in many circumstances.
Okay, so I also wanted to touch on education because I wanted your opinion on how the importance of education has evolved and how many years you study affect the opportunities that you have in your professional career. Is education still as important as it was 10, 20, 30 years ago? And I also say this thinking about my daughter that's now, 1.5 years old. Should I pay as much attention to her education as my parents paid to mine?
Education is crucial. Education, I think, if anything, is more important than it was 10, 20, or 30 years ago. What we've seen really across the world is an increasing focus on skill. And whether that's being driven by trade, whether that's being driven by technology and robots, lots of different forces are increasing the economic returns, the social returns to adults who really know how to do something very well. And I think that's coming through education. Now, sometimes that's going to be a university. Sometimes that's going to be like a skilled vocational track, right? There are many different ways to acquire skills, but the gap, for instance, in how much high-skilled versus low-skilled workers are paid has actually never been higher. And so I think that education in its many forms is really, it's never been more important than it is today.
What about the access to education? Is it more extreme as far as the inequality that we see now than traditionally in the last decades?
So I think that differs a lot depending on the circumstance. And so, for instance, in the United States, access to high quality education is often quite limited for a number of reasons. First of all, in the US, unlike in many countries across the world, education is primarily financed locally. And so you get families who really want to invest in education. They all live together in a town. There's very high education in that set of public schools, but then it gets very expensive to live there, and it becomes something that's not available to families from all backgrounds or children from all backgrounds. Similarly, in the US, we have a much larger focus on private education than in many other countries. And even though many of these universities have done a lot to improve financial aid opportunities over the past 20, 25 years, still the fraction of kids coming from low or middle income backgrounds at some of these places, including where I work at Brown University, it's really very, very low. So for instance, the share of kids coming from the entire bottom half of the distribution at Brown is actually the same as the share of kids coming from the top 1% of the income distribution in the US, just to give you one sense of how unequally distributed these things are.
Well, and the access to education and private education, or more high quality education, obviously has a lot to do with the quality of the teachers as well, right? And the kind of support that children have, that teenagers have. You've also done some work in researching the importance of teaching and teachers. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, teachers are unbelievably important. And I would say probably the most important part when we say, what is a high quality education? There are lots of things, but I think one of the most important things is having high quality teachers. We did a study where we looked at kids who had high quality and low quality teachers in the 5th grade. And then we were actually able to follow them about 20 years forward to see how that impacted whether they went to college, what they were earning as adults. And the amazing thing is that 1 year with a high quality teacher for a class of students, that's going to increase collectively their earnings by $1.5 million. That's just 1 year with a very high quality teacher. And so I think, again, you really can't understate the importance of having really high quality teachers. And so then I think in terms of policy, we need to make sure that the teachers that we have are getting trained as well as we can. We also need to make sure that we're attracting the very best people into teaching. What's amazing, if you look across countries, for instance, in the OECD, is that the role of teacher is very, very different. So for instance, in Finland, being a teacher is one of the highest prestige, most selective occupations you can be in. And then you look at how those students score on these various international tests or perform in other ways, and it shows.
You mentioned high quality teachers. How do you measure that?
So there are lots of different ways to measure high quality teaching. What's actually kind of cool is that they all kind of point in the same direction. So you can look at how a teacher's students perform on standardized tests. You can have other teachers or other people from the school come and observe the teachers. You can ask the students what they think of the teachers. Obviously you're going to get something a little bit different from all of these different things. You can even look to see whether a teacher's students are they showing up to school? Are they getting in trouble, for behavioral or disciplinary problems? All of these things are actually reasonably connected in a way that, you want to use a bunch of different measures in any given context, but more or less they're picking out a pretty similar underlying thing.
Well, when we talked about the American dream, you said that actually the social mobility in some European countries is better, or there are better conditions for it. Can you give us some examples of what those countries are and why you think it works? Or maybe tell us why the data explains why it works.
Sure. So let me give you an example. In the US, one way to measure mobility is just to ask, take kids who start in the poorest fifth of the income distribution, judged by the income of their parents. And these are typically children growing up at or below the poverty line. And ask how many of those kids are going to end up really succeeding economically in life, ending up in the top fifth of the income distribution. So about 7% of children born into poor families, by this definition, make that jump in their lives. But if you go to countries like Sweden or Denmark or France or Canada, that number is more like 12, 13%. So double the number of kids are making this kind of bottom to top. In the US, there was an author, Horatio Alger, that had these wonderful novels at the beginning of the 20th century about these, unbelievable success stories. So I like to think of it as kind of the Horatio Alger bottom to top success story. There are basically twice as many of those stories in many of these European countries or Canada than there are in the US.
Okay, so for example, you have a family, you have kids, I believe you have daughters as well. And talk to us about
I have two boys. I have two 8 and 10 are my boys.
Okay, so you have two boys. How do you condition them to believe that they have as many opportunities as whoever else is around them? And how do you motivate them, and maybe share data with them as well, to prove that it is possible and that it is up to them and not only the circumstances in which they were born or raised?
I think it's exactly as you say. It's just about giving kids the sense that anything is possible when you put your mind to it. And I think what we see in the data is that who you're hanging around, what are the adult role models that children have to look up to see as an example of what's possible, that's actually incredibly important in the data predicting who is able to make this type of jump and not. And so as a parent, that's really what I think about. I think about, it doesn't have to be a big thing, but making sure that children realize that they can achieve incredible things when they put their mind to it. And then, of course, part of that is going to come back to how they're studying in school and other academic things. But part of it is going to come back to more about, do they have grit? Are they willing to stick to it when inevitably things are going to get tough? Do they believe that even though it's tough right now, if I keep going, things are going to work out? Or do they say, things are tough, I don't think this is going to work, I'm just going to give up? I think that type of attitude is going to lead to many fewer opportunities, really, no matter what background you come from.
How much tougher is it for women to achieve social mobility? And how much has that changed according to what you've seen and what you've studied? And obviously it depends in which country you're talking about. What are some good examples and bad examples maybe?
Yeah, so for women, what's I think really striking is that in many ways, they've made phenomenal progress over the past 20, 30, 40 years. And then in other ways, they've really made more limited progress. So for instance, in most countries, more women attend and graduate from university than men. And that's a big change. And I think part of what's going on is that as more opportunities have become available to women, right, it's not just that women have those opportunities suddenly appearing before them as a 20 or a 30 or a 40-year-old. Now they know that these opportunities exist. And so even as girls growing up and then as young women, they have something to aim for. They are able to get that education. They're able to kind of plan in some sense to know that these opportunities are going to be available to them. Now, I think where the progress has been more limited is that, especially in, a number of kind of very high profile occupations. So for instance, CEOs of major companies or inventors or major scientists, politicians in some countries more than others, we see that the share who are women still really lags behind the share who are men. We also see incomes, especially after women have their first children, diverging quite a bit from men. And that's actually a fact that we see in almost all countries around the world. I mean, even looking in Scandinavian countries that are kind of legendary for their high levels of gender equality, you see women earning, 20, 30% less than men right after they have their first kids. And I don't mean like literally in the months after, I mean, in the kind of, 4 or 5 years after, that's where these gaps really start to emerge. And so I think that, from one perspective, in terms of creating that expectation, creating that sense that even for women too, anything is possible if you put your mind to it and work hard. I think, we've actually succeeded to a large extent in equalizing that with men, but still, I think there are these, structural factors that really limit, what women seem to be able to achieve in many sectors.
What did COVID do to social mobility? I know it's still very recent, and it's also fair to say that we're not out of COVID yet, as far as the number of cases and the impact that it's having, but it affected the way all of us work. It affected the way young people study. So what can you tell us about that, even if the data isn't really that profound yet?
Yeah, so obviously we don't know about the long-term effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and associated economic and educational, crises. But what we've seen so far, unfortunately, is really that it's exacerbated many of the inequalities and gaps that we see in society. So for instance, if you look at on the health side, COVID-19 infections and hospitalizations and deaths, that's something that's been much higher for people coming from lower income backgrounds or who are living in poor circumstances. We also see that the economic consequences have been much more concentrated among low-income workers and households. We saw for many high-income workers, there was a quite significant recession in many countries, but it really bounced back incredibly quickly, so that 5-6 months after COVID initially hit in spring of 2020, in many cases, high-income workers were back at work, and it was as if nothing had happened in terms of employment rates and incomes. Whereas for low-income workers, really there was still a very significant, even to this day, all those jobs really haven't come back. From an educational perspective, we talked about how important that is for children. Everybody went remote in spring 2020, but students in higher income circumstances, schools and families were able to deal with that better. And we see in the data that learning continued at a better rate for those students in spring 2020. And really for the last 2 years as well, we've seen schools be more likely to return in person when students or neighborhoods are in higher income circumstances. And we've seen poorer schools continue to struggle. And so I think this really created a huge challenge for all of our societies, as we, not exactly like we were tremendously happy with the progress we were making on inequality and mobility beforehand, now to have this enormous additional problem thrown in, I really think it raises the stakes for everything. Now, one thing that I can say, if I can just quickly say one thing, even though there's this enormous challenge that's been presented, I think what that has done, right, sometimes in these moments of crisis is really when new opportunities are available. And in many countries, we've seen a level of government response that really outstrips anything that we've seen before in recessions. So for instance, comparing to the way that many countries dealt with the COVID-19 recession, say as compared to the Great Recession and financial crisis 15 years ago, much more support for low-income families, much more support for schools, for health systems. And so I really think, sometimes they say politics is the art of the possible. We may be redefining what is possible as part of the policy response to COVID-19. And so that may be a little bit of a silver lining on what really has otherwise been a pretty dark cloud.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if one dark cloud wasn't enough with COVID and how long that has been lasting and affecting different countries and different economies at different rates and speeds, then you add to it another dark cloud of war. Obviously, it's still ongoing, but it's having a tremendous impact on the planet from a food perspective, a security perspective, a travel perspective, whatever way you want to look at it, it is affecting us and will affect us in the future. Is it too early to speculate about how this can also affect the opportunities that people have in different parts of the world, and how the economies will suffer as a result and businesses will suffer as a result?
Well, yeah, I mean, the war in Ukraine is obviously a terrible tragedy, especially for those who are directly involved, for the people of Ukraine and even the people in surrounding countries who are, from what I can see, doing amazing things to try to help refugees, to support them. That it's kind of a unprecedented shock in the past 30 or 40 years, a really terrible tragedy. I think as you get a little bit further from the war and Eastern Europe, so in Portugal or in the United States, right, there's not that direct effect of the war, but as you mentioned, the way it's really influencing things at the moment is through prices. And that's especially for food and for energy. Russia obviously produces quite a bit of the world's energy, especially for Europe. That's making supplies very difficult. And Ukraine and Russia together actually produce something like 12% of all traded calories. So this is really an enormous shock to the world's food supply as well. That's raising prices for food and energy around the world in a way that primarily is going to affect the budgets of lower income households. I've seen really terrible statistics about the extent to which, we have so many more families around the world now living in poverty because of the fact that the incomes that they have made it more difficult to buy food, to keep their house warm in the winter. I think in some countries, governments have the resources and hopefully the political will in order to do something about that. In many countries, especially in developing countries, those are often the countries that are going to be most affected by this. They may not have the resources to, support families in the way. And so I think that's kind of the next way, kind of immediate way in which this war is going to affect things. It's going to, deepen poverty. It's going to make that ladder that much longer to climb for people who are looking for social mobility. Over the longer term, I think also really both COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine, as well as more generally increasing geopolitical tensions between America and China and Russia, I think that's going to push back a little bit on what's really been kind of a unhalting march of globalization over the past 30 or 40 years. And in some cases, that's going to make things more expensive. So that's going to further raise prices. But also that's going to create different and more job opportunities around the world. And so I think, again, the question is not whether this is going to be good or bad. Inevitably, it's going to be a little bit of both. It's about how countries can respond to it. And if countries can give their children the education that they need in order to get those good jobs and be productive in whatever context, then I think they're going to be more able to respond well and maintain social mobility or even improve it, even as we see maybe globalization receding a little bit.
And I'm glad you mentioned globalization, because it is the last question I had in this main part of the interview, is that you feel that with these crises coming from the East, you mentioned obviously China and Ukraine and the relationships that these areas have with the Western world, is globalization under threat?
I think it is under threat. I think it's less that we're going to see globalization disappear, and more that I think we're going to start to see a few things come back home in terms of more domestic, more, even if it's international, more local production. More things will be made in Europe, in the United States. More things will be made both in the United States, in Mexico, and other countries in the Western Hemisphere. Still, if you compare the way the economy looks now to the way it looked 30 or 40 years ago, I don't think we're going to go really anywhere close back to where we were. So think about, there used to be lots of furniture factories in the United States, shoe factories, clothing factories. All of those have disappeared and moved primarily to Asia and Latin America. Many of those, the goods just aren't high enough value in order to support the type of wages that American workers need. And so I think, many of those jobs aren't coming back. I think where you are going to see more changes are in some of the very high-tech manufacturing. So for instance, most of the world's semiconductors at the moment are produced in Asia. I think you're going to see more of that being produced around the world so that countries feel like they can maintain a global supply. But again, those are very, very high-skilled jobs. Primarily it's actually about maintaining the machines and building these incredibly complicated factories. These fabs are, billions of dollars just for one plant. And so I think, the fact that globalization will be changing a little bit, still, I think, primarily it's those very high skilled jobs that are going to be available in high income countries, because those are the only jobs that are able to support a wage that people are excited about.
Yeah. Look, the main part of our conversation is over, but we do have some quick fire questions for you. So, in one sentence or so, I'd like to challenge you to answer some of these questions, which could obviously be answered in many more sentences and in a much more deep and profound way. But let's do it in a quick fire way.
I'll do my best to suppress my professorial instinct.
Yeah, let's keep it tight. What is one personality trait that you feel a good leader should have?
Vision.
Okay, so you went for one word. That's very good. I'm very impressed. What is the biggest challenge that humanity faces today, in your opinion, in your area of work?
I think global warming is the single greatest planet-wide threat to really all of our countries.
Yeah. If you could change one thing in the world today, according to your professional and personal experience, what would that be?
I would increase access to high quality education for children from all backgrounds. I think that's the thing that would make the most difference.
And what is the most important learning of your life? And as a result, what is the best advice that you can give in the area of social mobility?
I've yet to find something that's worthwhile doing that didn't take an enormous amount of effort and work. So I think there's no substitute for hard work and grit.
John, an absolute pleasure to speak with you. I think it's such an important topic, as well as all of us have ambitions, have dreams, have desires, have objectives, have goals, no matter how old we are, what our current status is, and understanding how those opportunities are created and where they are created and what can be done to protect them is incredibly important. So thank you so much for shedding light and sharing your insight with us on this.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for having me on your show.
An absolute pleasure. John Friedman a falar sobre como subir na vida e a explicar, obviamente, por que razão isto não é assim tão simples. Até breve.